When we talk about building Zach Wilson's supporting cast, most of the time we're focusing on wide receiver and offensive line. But there are other roles to fill, and we'll talk about them on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, March 8th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Today, our episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you for making this show your first listen or your first watch every day. We're free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, click the subscribe button. You'll receive automatic notifications as new episodes are posted. And if you're watching on YouTube, please, thumbs up for this episode. Helps other Jets fans find the channel. On today's show, we're going to talk about the running back and the tight end position as we continue our positional review series. We've been going through each position on the Jets roster, talking about how they performed in 2021 and looking ahead to the offseason. And the reason I'm combining running back and tight end into one show is I don't know that there's enough to talk about at either position for a full episode, so we're just going to combine them into this one episode. These are two positions where the Jets need to do some work. There's one difference, though. There's hope at the running back position based on what they have right now. The tight end position essentially needs to be completely overhauled. So we'll begin on the positive note, and we'll talk about the position where there is hope, and that's running back. And I think a lot of that, obviously, is because the Jets made a very good pick in the fourth round of the draft last year in Michael Carter. In fact, heading into the draft, I really was hoping the Jets would avoid picking a running back in the first 2 days because I felt like, and this was just kind of estimating, I felt like the top of the fourth round, there was probably going to be somebody good available. I mean, you could have talked me into it in the third round, but the Jets ended up trading both of their third round picks last year to move up for Elijah Vera Tucker. And there are many reports out there that they liked Michael Carter enough that they probably would have drafted him with one of those third round picks if they had kept them. A guy who just looks like a really good player and a guy who looks like a really good fit for the system the Jets run. Carter led the Jets with 639 yards, 4 touchdowns, averaged 4.3 yards per attempt, and he added 36 catches for 325 yards. A good one-cut runner, has good vision. And again, even though he's a little small, I talked about this yesterday, even though he's a little small, I think there's a perception the Jets really need a power back, and I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. I think if you look at the numbers, and again, very limited sample size, so take it with a grain of salt, but Carter, in pretty much any context you were looking for power, whether you're talking yards after contact, whether you're talking short yardage situations, whether you're talking about the Jets trying to close out a game late in the fourth quarter and everybody knows you're going to run it, Carter performed at least average in all of these areas, and in many of them was above average. So a guy who's going to be a good fit for this team going forward, again, a guy who I think is a very good fit for Mike LaFleur's system where you see lots of zone runs. But the NFL of 2022 is a league where the running back position is very specialized. And this was something that began decades ago. In fact, Mike LaFleur, we always talk about how Mike LaFleur worked under Kyle Shanahan in San Francisco and runs the quote-unquote Shanahan offense. Well, if you go back, I think there's a strong argument to be made that the devaluation of the running back began when Kyle's father, Mike Shanahan, was in charge of the Denver Broncos. And that team, every single year, it felt like they were putting in some new late round back, and they was rushing for 1,000 yards under this zone blocking scheme that Denver ran that is kind of taking the league by storm. So I think much of the focus this year in the offseason is going to be on finding somebody who fits well with Carter. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think what the Jets are looking for is a little bit different than the consensus out there. Now, after Carter, there's not a lot that's great. Now, I will say this. I'll give you the other positive I thought this season, and I thought that was Tevin Coleman. And listen, Tevin Coleman's not the guy he was in Atlanta. You know, all those years where he was part of a tremendous tandem with Devontae Freeman. He's clearly closer to the end of his career now. but he was the Jets' second leading rusher, 356 yards on 84 carries, a very solid 4.2 yards per attempt average. And again, he's a guy who, close to the end of his career, it was kind of just the Jets were kind of hoping they could get anything out of him. They got him for a very low price because he had been very injury plagued in recent seasons. And listen, he's not the guy he was in Atlanta, and I don't think the home run speed is there anymore. The trait that really made Tevin Coleman stand out, and I mean, even going back to when he was drafted out of Indiana, was he had home run speed. I don't think he has home run speed anymore, but he's got enough speed. He's got enough, and he's crafty, and he's tough, and showed a willingness on some runs this year to lower his shoulder, and give out some punishment. Very solid, I think, depth back, and he always has had a reputation for being one of the more nuanced receiving backs in the league. Always had a good reputation for being a solid pass blocker, also an excellent route runner. And for Tevin Coleman, I almost view his role as what decades ago was called as like the third down back, where you play sparingly on early downs if somebody needs a rest, and then you come in passing situations, and that could come into play, especially if the Jets have a young back that they're pairing with Carter, and you have a very young backfield, and you want a veteran in there on passing downs. Now, after that, I mean, you don't have a lot that's great. I think there were some hopes Ty Johnson could be a player for this team, and despite the fact he had a few moments, it really wasn't great. Very puzzling. Michael Nania, my friend who writes at JetsXFactor.com, was on the show a few weeks back, and he made a great point. You had this guy in Tevin Coleman who has great reputation in the receiving game. And how many times this year, now there were some games Coleman was out, he was hurt, they didn't really have a choice, but how many times this year did the Jets put Ty Johnson in on a passing down instead of Coleman? And I think if you watch the Jets this year, you don't need me to tell you that Ty Johnson was a problem in the receiving game. I mean, the one game which was ridiculous when he just couldn't catch a ball that was anywhere near him. Now, some of those throws were off target by Zach Wilson, but you'd like to see him help his quarterback out. Guy, it felt like he was a drop machine this year. Not a very productive receiver for this team out of the backfield. But for whatever reason, the Jets really liked throwing him the ball. In fact, he got as many targets as Michael Carter did this year. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Guy who major problem in the block. He was not a good blocker. And, as a runner, kind of mediocre. I mean, as I mentioned, this system is one where you kind of hope that somebody stands out, and you hope that you can find unheralded running backs who you can plug in, who fit the system well. It really did not work for Ty Johnson this year. He really was not all that productive. You also had Austin Walter, who averaged a little under 4 yards per carry, had a few moments. He was a guy who was kind of called up at the practice squad near in the second half of the season when guys got hurt. I'm not sure he's really part of the team going forward, but guy who had a few moments. And then you also have Michael Pirine, who, I got to be honest with you, even going back to draft day in 2020, I never really understood what Joe Douglas was doing in the third and fourth rounds. I really did not like any of the players the Jets drafted that year in the third and fourth rounds, aside from Cameron Clark, the guard who unfortunately has had to retire due to injuries. But you look at Ashton Davis, Jabari Zuniga, James Morgan, and Michael Pirine was the other guy. Jets had 5 picks between the third and fourth rounds. You got to find one player when you have 5 picks. I think sometimes we can overstate it. I'm not sure there's such thing as a fourth round bust, but there was never anything that wowed me about Michael Pirine's game. And now we're 2 years into his career, and there's still nothing that really wows me about his game. I don't really see where this is going. And even though the Jets had issues this year at running back past Michael Carter, even though they had injuries, Pirine never really made a mark. He only had 8 carries this season for 31 yards. I mean, we'll see. It's going to be tough for him going forward. So really, I mean, I think at the running back position right now, you have Michael Carter, who looks promising. You have Tevin Coleman, who probably a depth player at this point. I don't even think he's a guy you use in tandem with Carter. I think he's more of like your veteran leader in the locker room, the role that Frank Gore should have played. You go back to 2020 when the Jets built their offense around Frank Gore. The really frustrating part about that was I do think there was a role for Frank Gore on that team in 2020, and it was kind of the role I envisioned for Tevin Coleman, the veteran in the locker room, give him a few carries a game. Maybe he can take some of the young players under his wing and show them some of the nuances of the game. Maybe Coleman can show some of the younger guys pass protection, help them improve their route running. But I think that there is a pretty clear void, and the Jets are going to need to find somebody who complements Michael Carter well. There are some things to build on, however, which is a good thing, because it's not something you could say at the next position we're going to talk about. It is a position where the Jets are remarkably weak, bottom of the league, maybe the weakest spot on a roster that wasn't that great. Brace yourself, because we're going to talk about this position ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast. We're talking about the offseason right now. Free agency is not that far away, but it does mean football is over, at least as far as games go for the near future. Basketball, however, is full steam ahead for both pro and college hoops. In fact, we're entering championship week for college basketball, which means the NCAA tournament is right around the corner. After that, we'll be heading into the NBA playoffs. And from all the latest odds, totals, player performance props to where the next fired coach is going to land, BetOnline.net is the number one spot for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball, because BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, and UFC odds. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or your first watch every day. We're free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube and like what you see, please give this episode a thumbs up. Helps other Jets fans find the channel. Today we're talking about the running backs and the tight ends for the Jets in 2021. We just talked about the running backs, which means, unfortunately, there's nothing else we can do. We have to talk about the tight ends right now. I don't want to do it. You probably don't want to hear it, but we have to do it. This was not a good group heading into the season. It looked like a weak group on paper. It turned out to be a weak group. I mean, the only guy I could even see like wanting to bring back next year would be Tyler Kroft, and he was kind of miscast this year in retrospect. I had hopes maybe he could give you enough to be a tight end one. Not really. He had 16 catches. He had 173 yards. He only played 9 games. You can live with that, and he's a decent blocker, so you want him as a second tight end. I can live with it, but he's not a starter. And beyond that, I mean, you got Ryan Griffin, and listen, I don't want to bash Ryan Griffin too much, but I think we all know at this point in time, he had a few moments in 2019, which led to him getting a fairly lucrative extension. I mean, the Jets did not reset the market at tight end for him. He's not at the top of the league as far as salary goes, but I think we know at this point that extension was probably misguided. It came because the Jets were kind of scheming him open a bunch in the red zone, so we had a bunch of touchdowns that year, but it wasn't really Griffin beating guys one-on-one in coverage, and he's not much of a blocker. I mean, Griffin, I think, has pretty much one skill, and that's he can read coverages, so he can find the hole in his zone, and he can catch short passes. And if you combine that with quality blocking, I mean, I could see that Griffin might be a starting caliber tight end if he could do that, but he's just not a good enough blocker, and there's no real danger he presents to the defense in the passing game. Yeah, he can catch a check down, he can run a short route, but he can't stretch the field. And I just don't know that there's enough there to really justify paying a lot of money to this guy. And he just hasn't been productive since 2019. And even in 2019, I mean, I was talking about it at the time. It wasn't the type of production that was really sustainable. So, I mean, Griffin, you're talking about a guy who costs a couple $1 million against the cap. Probably want to move on from him. Another tight end the Jets have is Trevon Wesko, who they drafted him in 2019 in the 4th round. There was a lot of hype around his blocking, which seemed a bit misguided because he was kind of a developmental blocker entering the NFL. I will say this, I think he is developing into a pretty decent blocker. Now, the hype he got, people were talking about him being like the best blocking tight end in the NFL, which again, maybe it was based on his size, because you're looking at raw potential. Maybe you could have looked at him and said, okay, well, this guy has the potential to be one of the better blockers at the tight end position in the NFL. He's okay as a blocker. He's not bad. Interestingly, early in the season, he was kind of playing the fullback role, which he had done in the past, even when Adam Gase was head coach. They kind of took him out of that role as we moved forward. And this is one of the things about today's NFL. People say the fullback is extinct. That's not really true. teams use fullbacks. I think what's extinct is the guy who is on your roster and only plays the fullback role. I think that the guy who plays the fullback role for you has to do something else. And on most teams, they're also going to fill in at the tight end position. The ideal is somebody like Juszczyk in San Francisco, where, yeah, he plays fullback, but he also, goes into the slot, and he splits wide, and he's a weapon in the passing game. You can create mismatches with him. I don't think the guy who only plays fullback, though, can justify a spot on the 53-man roster anymore. So your fullback kind of has to do something else. And it was kind of interesting to me how the Jets took Wesko. I don't think he really saw him as much later in the season. He was more in an inline, traditional tight end type of role, so I'm not sure whether that means his role has shifted, whether they view him perhaps as their blocking tight end going forward, maybe a replacement for Croft as the second tight end. Kind of an interesting situation, but if Wesko's not going to be playing fullback, that's something that kind of takes away from his versatility. So that's certainly something worth considering. And then I think I'd be remiss talking about the tight end position without mentioning Daniel Brown, who had a very interesting journey this year. Now, Daniel Brown, you may not realize this, Daniel Brown was the guy who led the Jets in special team snaps in 2020, which tells me Brant Boyer really likes him. And he was traded midseason for Laurent Duvernay-Tardif. The Jets got a starting right guard for Daniel Brown, and then the Chiefs cut him, and the Jets brought him back, and he actually saw some action late in the season. Now, this is a guy who's really more of a special teamer. He played a bit in 2019. I remember he had one touchdown catch against Washington in 2019, but a guy who's more of a special teamer and, sees extensive special team snaps when he's in the lineup for the Jets. But, you look at this tight end position, not a whole lot there, and that position is going to have to be upgraded in the offseason. So we've talked about running back. We've talked about tight end. What can the Jets do to upgrade these two spots? Who's available in free agency? Do they look to the draft? We'll talk about all of this ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. The Jets certainly have to fix the tight end position. Well, if you're looking to fix your car or truck, go to rockauto.com. Because with the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. So save time and money when using Rock Auto. You should know that Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years, and their prices are reliably low for every customer. Go explore their easy-to-use website, rockauto.com, to find the solution for your auto parts needs. Again, that's rockauto.com. Go there right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. And write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Tuesday, we're talking about the running back position and the tight end position for the Jets today. So what do the Jets do this offseason? Well, I've kind of alluded to what I think needs to happen at the running back position. I would like to see Tevin Coleman brought back on a cheap deal, maybe get a couple carries a game, kind of serve as like the veteran mentor, hopefully help Michael Carter learn a little bit more about pass protection. Beyond that, though, I think the Jets need to find a back to pair with Michael Carter. And I mentioned this yesterday. I think the perceptions that they need a power back, I'm not convinced of that. I think what they may need is kind of like a home run hitter out of the backfield, because I'm not sure Coleman still has the speed to hit home. I think he's got adequate speed. I think he's got like maybe one more year in him, but I don't think he's the home run hitter the Jets need. And it's not that Carter is incapable of producing big plays, but I'm not sure he just has like that extra gear. And I think he's decent in power situations. So instead of a power back, I want somebody who can kind of make a big play. It's a threat to take it the distance when he gets the ball in his hands. Now, I'll say this. I don't love the idea of the Jets spending in free agency. I can live with it. In this system, there's a specific skill set you need. You need vision, you need patience, you need the ability to make one cut and get up the field as fast as possible. Typically, you can find an affordable back like this on the market. If the Jets want to go the veteran route, there's a guy, Raheem Mostert, who's got a lot of experience in the system, but he's kind of, I feel like in some ways he's kind of a duplicate of Tevin Coleman, although less ability in the passing game. So, I don't know if that's the direction you want to go in, but I don't love the idea of the Jets spending on running back in free agency just because it's never, and they always go for these big names. I mean, you look at the last dozen years for the Jets. You've got Matt Forte, it didn't work out. You've got Frank Gore, it didn't work out. Le'Veon Bell, Chris Johnson. I mean, you name it. Even going back to LaDainian Tomlinson, who, and I know people remember LaDainian Tomlinson as a success story for the Jets. After that first month, he had a big first month for the Jets. After that, the better part of his next 2 years were pretty unproductive. So one of the things I think you have to look at this if you're the Jets, look at the guys who have been successful for you. You had Bilal Powell, probably the best Jets back of the past decade, 4th round pick. Michael Carter you got in the 4th round. Looks like a productive back after 1 year. So the draft is the area to look in. I don't know that you need to wait till the 4th round. I mean, I mentioned a couple guys yesterday. Kenneth Walker out of Michigan State, who has a lot of speed. I think a really good fit for the system. I just don't know if the Jets are going to use a pick that high. And I think the other issue with Walker is that clearly, if you look at the numbers last year, the Jets want all of their backs to be part of the passing game. And Walker was not really involved in the passing game at Michigan State. Doesn't mean he can't do it, but I think that's a question mark. You also have Breece Hall out of Iowa State. Really solid back. Guy who looks like it could be a good fit. And I think, if you get one of these backs, or if somehow they fall to 68, even though it's the 3rd round, I think you do it. I actually, with 4 picks in the top 40, if you think a back's going to be exceptional, and usually I'd be against drafting a running back early, but I don't even have a big problem with the Jets maybe using one of the 2nd round picks. A trade down situation would always be ideal, but you might be able to talk me into one of these guys in the 2nd round. But I think it has to be done through the draft, and if you'd go a little later, there are some guys available, but my focus would be more on the draft than free agency. And interestingly, tight end, I think I would have the opposite approach, because tight end's a very difficult position to learn. So I've got no issue if the Jets want to draft a Trey McBride or Jeremy Ruckert. Ruckert was a guy who was reportedly impressing the coaching staff at the Senior Bowl out of Ohio State. A guy who wasn't really used in the Ohio State offense all that frequently in the passing game because, they had Olave, they had Garrett Wilson, they had all these other guys. So maybe there's some untapped potential there, the way there was with maybe like a Dawson Knox a couple of years ago when Dawson Knox was playing at Mississippi with A.J. Brown and DK Metcalf and wasn't used in the passing game all that much. And Trey McBride, I think, at this point, looks like the number 1 tight end in this draft class. Got no problem with drafting them, but I always like, especially at the tight end position, to draft somebody and make them the 2nd tight end the first year. Now, the free agent market's looking less great than it did a few days ago because David Njoku out of Cleveland looks like he's getting franchised. Dalton Schultz out of Dallas could be franchised. There still are some affordable options there. If you want a blocking tight end, you've got Max Williams out of Arizona who's going to hit free agency. Gerald Everett's always a guy with the potential guy who, even though he's been kind of a disappointment in his career, has never really fulfilled the potential. Still has been more productive than any guy the Jets have had out there. Mo Alley Cox, I think, could be a good fit for the Jets. Jets kind of want to do it all tight end. Cox is a good blocker, and I feel like there's enough athletic ability there that perhaps there's some untapped potential out of the receiving game. So lots of different options at the tight end position. I prefer to see running back addressed in the draft. Hopefully find somebody who's kind of a home run hitter to pair with Carter. And then you could double dip at tight end. You could sign a free agent and draft somebody. In fact, that could be the way the Jets end up going because the Jets, I think Mike LaFleur especially, would love to have more 2 tight end sets. He kind of had to go away from that after the first few weeks because of the personnel issues. So still a lot of options, even if the top guys are off the market. The only top guy, if Dalton Schultz gets tagged and if David Njoku gets tagged, the only top tight end guy in free agency would be Mike Gesicki, who's really not a tight end. He's really more of a wide receiver. And I actually really like players like Mike Gesicki, but I don't think he's a very good fit. So I think you're probably looking at a lower end free agent option, and then maybe you draft somebody at the tight end position. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you have to say about these 2 positions, but that's all for today. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, if you enjoy the show, subscribe to it and leave it a 5-star review if you're listening on a podcast source, and give this episode a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. That helps the channel out tremendously. Hope you have a great Tuesday, everybody. Send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we will have our weekly mailbag show.